My name is Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and Public Life, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. A number of individuals made today's lecture possible. I want to thank them at the beginning here. This lecture is part of Notre Dame's forum, ND Forum, a year-long themed event of lectures and like this one and others. The theme of the forum this year is going global. It's sponsored by the President's Office, so I want to thank Father Jenkins for asking us to be a part of this year's forum. The Center for Ethics and Culture is a co-sponsor of today's event and a co-sponsor of Professor Mark's visit to Notre Dame, so I'm especially thankful to their new and improved leadership, Professor Deneen, and I suppose Professor Sneed as well. Additional sponsors of today's lecture are the Kellogg Institute, Notre Dame Law School's program on Church, State, and Society, and also NDIAS. And those organizations are run by three very generous and good friends, Paulo Carrozza, Rick Garnett, and Brad Gregory, so thank you to them as well. Our purpose here at the Tocqueville Program is to foster conversation, research, teaching about religion and public life, and there's really no more pressing issue right now than the issue of religious freedom. And we have, I can't imagine a better speaker to speak on the international dimensions of religious freedom than our guest today. The lecture is also brought to you in conjunction with our undergraduate fellows. We have a handful of undergraduate fellows that help us figure out what we're going to do and help us host our speakers. And I'm going to introduce one of our this year's fellows, J.P. Geschwin, who will introduce our speaker. J.P. is a senior PLS major on the way to New York to become a Tocqueville Program benefactor. So, J.P.?
Dr. Daniel Mark is chairman of the 9-member bipartisan U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He was appointed to the commission by then Speaker of the House, John Boehner, in May 2014, and reappointed in May 2016 by Speaker Paul Ryan. For the current academic year, Dr. Mark is on leave from Villanova University and residing here at Notre Dame as a visiting Tocqueville Fellow in the Department of Political Science. Dr. Mark teaches and writes in the areas of political theory, philosophy of law, American political thought, and politics and religion. He holds a BA, MA, and PhD in politics from the Department of Politics at Princeton University, where he wrote his dissertation under the direction of Professor Robert George on the subject of authority and legal obligation. His address today is titled The End of Religious Freedom, Challenges from the Right and Left Around the Globe. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark.
Thank you very much. I left my speech under the podium here. I was like, one of these days, you guys just pick up the speech and start reading it. Let's see what happens. But thank you very much for the introduction. It's really an honor to be speaking here to all of you, and it's an honor, truly, to be a visiting faculty member this year at the legendary University of Notre Dame. Thank you to President Father Jenkins and the ND Forum for being a lead sponsor of this event. Thank you to my main sponsor and guardian angel this year, Philip Munoz, head of the Tocqueville Program and Constitutional Studies. I have a lot of the same thank yous that he said, so I'll say them real quick, but thank you to my other supporters this year as well, Brad Gregory of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, Rick Garnett of the Program on Church, State, and Society, and Carter Sneed of the Center for Ethics and Culture. And thank you also to Paulo Carrozza of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies for further co-sponsorship of this lecture. Thank you to all of these just named Notre Dame luminaries for their mentorship and friendship to me during my year as a visiting fellow. You students who are in the room are extraordinarily lucky to have these professors and the programs that they lead. What a great place here. Very special thanks also, I don't know if she's still here, to Jen Smith, who runs the show for Professor Munoz, and without whom this and so much else besides would not be possible. So thank you to Jen. There she is for making everything work. I think she's out of the room now, making things work. Finally, thank you to the Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University for this attention-grabbing tie, which I know will keep you on me with laser-like focus during the course of this lecture. You probably can't, I bring it up for a particular reason, you can't see necessarily from where you're sitting unless you've got real eagle eyes, but it does, the pattern is actually 1776 and says that over and over, making the show, and that's a little bit of foreshadowing for the lecture here. In any case, as you heard, I'm Daniel Mark. I'm a professor at Villanova, visiting professor here, and chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Just so we're clear, I want to mention that I'm speaking now only for myself, not the institutions with which I'm affiliated. Having said that, I would be more than happy to take questions during the Q&A about the commission, about anything else, and I will definitely try to leave plenty of time for Q&A so we can have a good conversation. 150 years ago this June, the Edgardo Mortara case shocked the world. Edgardo Mortara, a 6-year-old Jewish boy in Italy, was taken from his family by papal authorities and raised as a Catholic under the supervision of the Pope. This was done under the law in Bologna, then part of the Papal States, after it was discovered that 5 years earlier, the boy's Catholic nanny had secretly baptized the 1-year-old child when he fell ill and she feared he was going to die. The law required that this quote-unquote Catholic boy receive a Catholic education. This story, a major sensation at the time that had vast repercussions, has garnered added attention lately because of coverage in First Things, long the country's premier journal of religion and public life, coverage of the recent publication of an English edition of Mortara's memoirs. The article in First Things on the new translation got so much attention because the article's author appeared to be justifying the abduction of the boy by the Pope and his police. Or if justifying is too strong of a word, I'll say explaining sympathetically. Needless to say, this brought some heat on First Things' editor, who was criticized for publishing the piece. It's not my plan to discuss the Mortara case itself, or the questionable article inspired by the memoir, or even the wisdom of publishing such a piece. But I do want to take as my starting point for this lecture the opening line of the editor's response to the criticism of his decision to print the article. Quote, "The Edgardo Mortara episode is a stain on the Catholic Church. Whatever one thinks about the efficacy of baptism, forcibly separating a child from his parents is a grievous act. And even if one can construct a theoretical rationale for doing so, as Ramon Cesario, the author of the article, does, it was wildly imprudent for Pius IX to take Edgardo from his parents, given the scandal it brought upon the Catholic Church, a scandal that continues to this day." Unquote. In considering these words, setting aside politics and motivations and so forth, what we have before us is a fundamental issue concerning religious freedom. We have before us the underlying question of whether people have the right to choose and live their faith free from interference by the government, or whether the limits of religious freedom are determined solely by judgments of prudence, such as whether encroachments on religious freedom will detract from a state's international standing. In other words, we have the question of whether people have a right to religious freedom in principle or only in practice when it suits the state. Skipping for a moment to the punchline, let me say that I take the first view, namely that religious freedom is a God-given, inalienable right. To be sure, this does not mean that the right to religious freedom has no limits. Like with other rights, reasonable limits can and do exist, but the nature and scope of those limits too will have to be the subject of another talk. Here instead, I'd like to make the case for why it is more important than ever to articulate the principled case for religious freedom. I'll begin by describing a variety of ways in which religious freedom is threatened, from the right, from the left, and around the globe, ways that together combine to create a landscape in our time that is deeply worrisome. From there, I will suggest a way forward in defending religious freedom. Given the battles over the scope of the First Amendment in this country, some of which this university has recently been involved in, I am sure that many of you are eager to hear about religious freedom in the West. But before that, I want to address religious freedom outside the West, where in so many places religious freedom is imperiled. The peril comes from what I'll call the totalitarian threat. This totalitarian threat has two prongs, one religious and one secular. We find religious totalitarianism in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia. The recent developments in Saudi Arabia suggest that that country may be headed in a new direction. We'll see. What's critical to remember about those places is that the problem isn't just religious freedom for minorities. It's religious freedom for everyone. Even if an individual or a group, or even the majority of the country, happens to adhere to the state-enforced version of religion, those people do not possess religious freedom. None of them is free to dissent or change or deny. None of them is free to adhere to a different version of the government-backed sect. Things may be worse for religious minorities, but the theocratic ways of these countries deprive the entire population, not just minorities, of religious freedom. I should acknowledge, by the way, that Professor Dan Philpott is here. He's certainly Notre Dame's expert and a world expert on international religious freedom, and it's an honor to be his friend and sometimes student. Such violations of religious freedom are not new, of course, but in many ways, the threat is growing. ISIS is the epitome, and thus far the peak, of such extremism. The caliphate stands for religious totalitarianism. Thank God, ISIS has been beaten back in some places, but it lives on in many others. And the ideology is not going away anytime soon either. On the contrary, as ISIS has receded, Iran and its oppressive ways has spread noticeably into Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and other places in the region. In May, I traveled to Pakistan. It's beautiful in May, you should try. Despite the heavy influence of the military, I would not classify Pakistan as totalitarian, yet the situation in that country has regressed significantly. Very shortly before my visit, a Muslim university student was lynched following an accusation of blasphemy. His name was Mashal Khan. Pakistan, sadly, is a world leader in prosecutions, convictions, and imprisonments for blasphemy, with some even on death row. But perhaps worse is the horrific vigilante violence perpetrated against the accused in so many cases. This violence is fostered by a climate of impunity that often sees accusers and attackers suffer no penalties for their actions. The case I mentioned of the university student was particularly notable because it exploded the narrative in Pakistan that blasphemy accusations and accompanying attacks mainly affect poor and illiterate religious minorities, such as in the dispute between farmhands that landed the innocent Christian woman Asya Bibi in prison on spurious charges of apostasy. The victim in the university case was a young, educated, well-to-do Muslim man murdered by his fellow students in the name of a toxic totalitarian ideology that brooks no deviations and no dissenters. I will say more about blasphemy laws, but let me add another word about Pakistan first. One group targeted for egregious discrimination in Pakistan, and there is more than one, but one is the Ahmadis, a sect that other Muslims consider to be heretical. They're like the Muslim Mormons, followers of a latter-day 19th century prophet at odds with the more traditional adherents of their faith. Ahmadis are despised throughout the Muslim world, but in Pakistan they are singled out even in the country's constitution for special official discrimination. For instance, in order to vote, Ahmadis must renounce their beliefs. They are not allowed to call themselves Muslims, and they are not allowed to call their houses of worship mosques. Recently, the government proposed a very modest change to the wording of the law that would not guarantee, but might open the door to Ahmadis voting freely. In reaction to this tiny step, protesters brought the capital city of Islamabad to a standstill. Yet a situation the government was able to resolve only by yielding to the demands that the change in the law be withdrawn and the law minister who introduced the proposal resign. The blasphemy laws in Pakistan are an enormous problem, but I suspect you'll be surprised to learn the extent of blasphemy regulations around the world. In 2016, USERF, our commission, released a report that constituted a first ever attempt, as far as we know, to catalog and analyze all the blasphemy laws in the world. I encourage you to check it out on our website, usurf.gov. Guess how many countries have blasphemy laws? Guess in your mind. Guess how many countries have blasphemy laws? Almost 70. A third of the countries in the world. Surprised? Well, you'll be even more surprised when you learn which countries have them. In addition to the usual suspects, and there are plenty of usual suspects, the list includes Austria, Brazil, Canada, our nice neighbor to the north, Cyprus, Finland, Germany, Ireland, Italy, New Zealand, Spain, and Switzerland, just to name a few. To be sure, blasphemy laws in those countries are often not enforced or are enforced minimally. Yet we on the Commission believe that all countries should repeal their blasphemy laws, as Denmark and Malta have recently. Why is this so important? Well, for one thing, we think it will set a good example and put pressure on countries in which blasphemy laws are enforced more vigorously, often with brutal consequences. But at the heart of the matter, it's because of the principle that's at stake. Religious freedom, as enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, entails that, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance, unquote. For that right to be secure, the right to believe and to change one's beliefs, people must be free to deviate or dissent from the local orthodoxy. They must be allowed to reject the local gods and to call their own by whatever name they see fit. Blasphemy laws, enforced or not, establish that in principle, the government can regulate what you believe. And I say believe because true belief is so often inseparable from the expression of that belief in one form or another. Blasphemy laws establish that one's religious freedom isn't a right in the proper sense, but an entitlement or privilege subject to judgments of prudence by the state. Thus, religious totalitarianism ultimately aims to control the entire person, even down to one's thoughts. This much it certainly shares with its secular counterpart. This brings us to the other major threat to religious freedom abroad, secular totalitarianism. In some cases, the totalitarianism is truly ideologically secular. While religious totalitarianism fears false gods, secular totalitarianism fears the true God. This is the case, for example, in China, where the communist state is officially atheist. For Chinese officials, and the same goes for other communist dictatorships, religion is a threat because it offers a source of authority and allegiance outside of the ruling party. So they are very keen to stamp out religious freedom wherever it flourishes, free from government control. China can tolerate the state-appointed bishops, if you're following the news lately, but not the underground ones. One group that is severely oppressed in China is the Uyghur Muslims. And I think probably good that I mentioned I literally came down here, leaving early a conference call with the new president of the World Uyghur Congress. Earlier today, I was on a conference call with a Catholic priest who's visiting from Cuba and is a leader, another totalitarian dictatorship, and another hero of religious freedom there. And so a pretty fitting day that coincidentally ended up being my day up until this point. But as for the Uyghur Muslims in China, lately the government has stepped up its oppression of their practice of Islam with far-reaching measures, including prohibitions on long beards, on fasting during Ramadan. They'll even place policemen in their homes during Ramadan to ensure they're not fasting, and even on giving children certain Muslim names. The Uyghurs are found mostly in Western China, and the government perpetrates these violations, claiming separatist agitation among the Uyghurs. Although Islamist extremism is a real threat in the world, the Chinese government does not merit the benefit of the doubt when it comes to religious freedom in particular or human rights in general. As far as we can tell, the majority of Uyghur Muslims are peaceful, and their treatment is plainly unjust. I raise the issue of the Uyghur Muslims in China because it points to a wider phenomenon of secular governments, mostly authoritarian ones, repressing religion in the name of security. This is particularly true in the Central Asian states of the former Soviet Union, affectionately known as the Stans, but also including Azerbaijan. Once again, I concede that the worldwide threat of Islamist extremism is real. Yet too often, legitimate security concerns are used as a pretext for excessive restrictions on religious freedom. I was in Azerbaijan a few years ago. This was true. I was in Uzbekistan a couple months ago. This is certainly true there as well. In these countries, through elaborate systems of registrations and approvals, the governments regulate and monitor all religious activity. Muslims, who make up the vast majority of these mostly secular countries, as well as Christians and other small groups, suffer unjustly in the name of national security. Here, the government is not so much seeking to impose an ideology as it does in a theocracy, yet it hopes to bolster the state's unrivaled authoritativeness by preserving the society's irreligious character. In some ways, admittedly, the state-centered vision becomes a stand-in for religion, North Korea being the most radical and most ridiculous example. Either way, the end result is that both religious and secular totalitarianism take religion, and therefore religious freedom, as their enemy. From that perspective, we in the West have it pretty good. Serving on USERF, which monitors and reports on the worst religious freedom situations in the world, I am acutely aware of how our challenges at home pale in comparison to what goes on abroad. But the lesson from this is not what you think. It's not that we should feel so good as to become complacent or quiescent about our own present circumstances. On the contrary, the painful international scene should be an ever-present reminder to us of how rare, how precious, and how vulnerable religious freedom is, and how vigilant we must be in defending it. We're not inherently better or more deserving of religious freedom than anyone else in the world, and we should not take our good fortune for granted. Rather, we must work hard to preserve the cultural and then the political and legal conditions that make religious freedom possible. In short, we should not make either mistake. We should neither exaggerate our problems here and forget how good we have it, nor should we exaggerate our blessings and neglect the defense of religious freedom. Moreover, developments in our own civilization already show us how the erosion of this sacred right can occur. So let me talk about domestic challenges to religious freedom from the right and the left today. To ward off any misunderstanding, I hasten to add that I am not hung up at all on the labels right and left. But those terms are useful shorthand that everyone understands, so I'm sticking with them. I'm going to start with the challenge from the left because I think it's more obvious and better known. In the big picture, there is some good news. Important religious liberty cases lately have come up 9-0 in the Supreme Court, though admittedly, many of the cases on the most sensitive social issues have been 5-4. Other political legal trends are worrying, such as the failure of the original Religious Freedom Restoration Act here in Indiana, and similar problems elsewhere, not to mention many actions by the Obama administration. More worrying still are the sociological trends. I think you know this, it is cliche by now that the fastest growing religious group in America is the nuns. Not religious sisters in habits, but those who check none, N-O-N-E, none, on surveys of religious affiliation. That is worrying for plenty of reasons. But for our purposes today, my concern about this trend is that people who do not value religion are unlikely to value religious freedom. People who do not value religion are unlikely to value religious freedom. When some accuse religious freedom of being nothing more than camouflage for bigotry, we must do more than simply assert that we have the right under the First Amendment to be bigots. We must make an affirmative case instead for the value of religion and therefore of religious freedom. Otherwise, we will surely soon see legislatures, courts, and agencies redefining the right of religious freedom and narrowing the scope of its protection. If you doubt this, look at what's happening with guns. And I put this to you as evident regardless of where you stand on that issue. Many on the left obviously don't think gun rights should exist in the first place, but they are stuck with the inconvenient fact that gun rights are protected by the Constitution. So their project involves seeing how far gun rights can be limited within that framework, if the Second Amendment cannot be repealed altogether. As a thought experiment, imagine if people no longer valued the press. How long would freedom of the press remain protected, given all the mischief the press causes, from reporting on worthless celebrity gossip that debases us, to undermining national security by revealing classified information? It would be easy to roll back the free press in the name of combating these ills. So too with religious freedom. If Americans do not appreciate the importance of religion, then religious freedom will fall to claims of discrimination. As I alluded to a moment ago, the main challenges to religious freedom in the West today stem from identity politics, and especially identity politics pertaining to sex. Declining adherence to traditional faiths further enables this assault on religious freedom. But there is something deeper at play and at stake here. Underlying the identity politics of sex, and therefore the current attacks on religious freedom as discrimination, is a postmodern, from Professor Philip Bess here in architecture, better called hypermodern, denial of human nature that amounts to a rejection of all reason and all authority. I better repeat that. Underlying the identity politics of sex, and therefore the current attacks on religious freedom as discrimination, is a denial of human nature that amounts to a rejection of reason and authority. This movement, in essence, rejects anything that stands in the way of radical personal autonomy, not only to choose unrestrained what we do, but even what we are. Although the point of this destructive ideology, the purpose of it, may not be an attack on the church is, for all intents and purposes, the main enemy, because it is the standard bearer of and chief witness to everything the other side wishes to deny. In fairness, all the major world religions stand in the way of the idea that life's deepest meaning or purpose is found in shaping ourselves and our world according to our will. It's just that in our country, the church has the good fortune of being the lead representative on our side. One central consequence of this denial of human nature is that it leads ineluctably to a denial of human rights. Without a firm view of human nature, we cannot construct a coherent account of human rights. I am aware, of course, that the people I have in mind here claim all sorts of things in the name of human rights. But the new menu of human rights is selective, subjective, and finally indefensible. Indeed, the contradiction of inventing some new rights while disparaging others, like religious freedom, proves the precise point I want to make, that the left has sufficiently confused the concept of rights as to make it useless. The inconsistency is built into their thinking because without reason in nature, there's no longer a sound philosophical basis for discovering what is a right and what isn't. Having abandoned the proper grounds for human rights in order to make room for the ever-expanding list of demands, they have left the concept of right so thin, or so watered down, if you prefer that metaphor, that the very idea is endangered. So it's not just that the right of religious freedom is under attack because traditional beliefs are a threat to radical autonomy. The notion of rights itself is under attack, and necessarily so by the logic of the thing, if those other ends are to be pursued, the ends of radical autonomy. So that's the view looking to the left. Now on to the right. Today I want to discuss two separate strands on the right, and I want to be very clear, for the record, that I'm distinguishing them. The first strand I have in mind is the alt-right, a term which lately seems to have disappeared from our national vocabulary as quickly as it appeared. Nevertheless, the phenomenon bears addressing, if briefly. In a way, the alt-right is like those I've described on the left, in that it represents another kind of identity politics and rejects the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings captured so memorably in the Declaration of Independence. Insofar as the alt-right is right at all, it is right-wing in a way that is mostly alien to American conservatism, the latter, American conservatism, being a version of classical liberalism. This fundamental divide between the alt-right's identity politics of race and nation on one hand, and classical liberalism on the other hand, is partly why the antagonism between the Republican Party's uneasiest of bedfellows is so bitter, I think. Yet there is another challenge to classical liberalism from the right, and it is a significant one. In the realm of ideas, these critics are much more consequential than the alt-right, and they may have more long-term political sway because they dwell among the elite opinion makers. And let me note that this includes some people I like and respect, including several at this university, even as we disagree. I mentioned earlier that we need to safeguard the cultural and then the political and legal conditions that make religious freedom possible. As I see it, those conditions arose from the confluence of Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian ideas and civilizations. Yet even among those who acknowledge the Christian roots of the American system specifically, some argue that the fusion of Christianity and Enlightenment thinking drew too much on the latter. Put crudely, that America is too much John Locke. And hopefully all the students in the room, at least your students in the room, Professor Medios, know who John Locke is and what he's about, for better or worse. For these critics, the problem with classical liberalism isn't that we're doing the American experiment wrong, that we've lost our way and forgotten the vision of the founders, but that the American experiment is fatally flawed and bound to fail. They reject classical liberalism in principle, and especially its emphasis on individual rights. I accept that the individualist tendencies of classical liberalism need to be balanced with other values, such as community and authority. But not because classical liberalism is itself poison. Indeed, I think all conservatives agree that individual rights are not enough. But the question is whether they are actually the problem. Though it would be overstating things to say that these thinkers constitute a group or a school of thought, the net result of their work is a constellation of figures on the right today who in different ways and for different reasons variously question political liberty, economic liberty, and religious liberty. One of the most famous critics on the right of our current state of affairs is the author and blogger Rod Dreher, who spoke here last semester under Professor Munoz's auspices as well. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of his book, The Benedict Option. First, a disclaimer. Thanks to that fall event, a great event, by the way, I know Rod Dreher, and I know his book very well, and he is not arguing for many of the things that have come to be associated with the phrase Benedict Option. But because of what it has come to mean for so many, taken on a life of its own, it is a handy term. In defining the Benedict Option, Dreher sometimes uses the phrase strategic retreat, which is more modest. But for others, the Benedict Option means heading to the hills or circling the wagons. Whatever Dreher himself means, those others are the folks I'm concerned with. For those who see the ills of our society and accept that some reaction is necessary, which includes me, the debate over what to do really matters and is quite revealing. The question for Benedict Option advocates of all stripes is, what exactly do you intend in your retreat, strategic or otherwise? Is the plan to escape classical liberalism altogether, or to batten down the hatches and ride out the storm until classical liberalism comes back to its senses? Do they want their Benedict Option communities to be oases of classical liberalism in a world gone mad? Or will their communities be refuges from classical liberalism? I joked with Dreher when he was here that his book ought to have been titled Live Like Orthodox Jews. But there is an important division, and I have two experts with me in the room, but there is an important division between modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. Modern Orthodox Jews, like myself, cluster in small, walkable neighborhoods, insist on sending their children to Jewish schools, emphasize regular prayer, all things Dreher recommends. Ultra-Orthodox Jews do all of that and more, but they do it in the context, typically, of an in-principle rejection of Western culture and Western values, maintaining only an instrumental relationship with the society. Again, leaving aside what Dreher himself wants, let's ask what the related critics of classical liberalism envision. Is their goal to build a newer, better, likely smaller Christendom? Or is their goal to create just enough space to rebuild a Christian culture within a classical liberal order? Do they wish to reground individual rights on a true and sound basis? Or do they wish to instrumentalize, minimize, and relativize individual rights, which they see as inimical to the common good in the long run? Do they believe in political, economic, and religious liberty not just in prudence, but in principle? Do they believe that it was wrong for the Pope to kidnap Edgardo Tarah, or just poor judgment about the consequences? In the end, do they see classical liberalism and Christianity as compatible or incompatible? Let me repeat my earlier concession. The critics may say that I am naive about classical liberalism, but if so, my naivete only goes so far. I am not here to contend that religious freedom and individual rights are enough on their own. That was not the founders' view, and it is not mine. As John Adams said, liberty can no more exist without virtue and independence than the body can live and move without a soul. When I talk about preserving the conditions that nourish the best features of the American order, I recognize that liberty alone is insufficient. Virtue, which requires religion, is also necessary. To be sure, classical liberals and the critics acknowledge that virtue and religion are necessary for a flourishing society. But the critics contend that classical liberalism itself necessarily, inevitably, undermines the very conditions that make its own existence possible. In other words, that classical liberalism is cannibalistic. They argue, or at least imply, that individual rights rot a free society from the inside. If they're right, then it is futile to try to foster a Christian culture within a classically liberal order for the long term. This is why we hear more and more today about integralism, about unseparating church and state, about Christian monarchists. At the risk of oversimplifying, I will say that those conversations don't sound like they're about restoring a Christian culture in a liberal order, but about restoring Christendom. So let me counter one Catholic intellectual movement with another, namely the movement that culminated in the Second Vatican Council, and specifically the papal encyclical on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae. The critics are correct to worry about rights, when rights means doing the freedom to do whatever you feel like doing. But the best versions of classical liberalism have never accepted that. The correct view is embedded in the old distinction in our language between the terms liberty and license. License is the freedom to do whatever you want. Liberty is the freedom to pursue the good. What is so important about Dignitatis Humanae is that it points us to a proper understanding of rights by grounding the right of religious freedom in the good of religion. Here, I am partly indebted to Professor Carrozza for his work on this. Luckily for him, he couldn't be with us today because he's spending the semester in Italy. Rights are justified in virtue of the goods they allow us to pursue. That is, we cannot understand what rights are and which rights are until we understand what rights are for. To recover a proper account of rights, we must start with a proper account of goods and the good. Once we know what is truly good for our nature, what is truly part of human flourishing, then we can know which rights are real and which aren't. Free speech, for example, is essential to the good of truth because true knowledge must be held in light of all available evidence and arguments. And religious freedom is essential to the good of religion because in order to be genuine, it must be freely chosen. The rights protect the goods. Let me quote one passage along these lines from Dignitatis Humanae. It is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all men should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. They are also bound to adhere to the truth once it is known and to order their whole lives in accord with the demands of truth. However, men cannot discharge these obligations in a manner keeping with their own nature unless they enjoy immunity from external coercion as well as psychological freedom. Therefore, the right to religious freedom has its foundation not in the subjective disposition of the person, but in his very nature. End quote. Underpinning the right is a good, even a duty here in this passage, toward which the right points and which it safeguards. Now let us turn back to international religious freedom for a moment. In many places, as you can imagine, including the places I've described, Pakistan, China, and so forth, Cuba, we are not asking whether religious freedom will be preserved, but whether it will emerge. And it will matter in these places not just whether the idea of individual rights gain hold, but what notion of individual rights, liberty or license. Insofar as liberalism does spread, and it may not, but insofar as it does, will it be the kind that cherishes and nurtures religious freedom, or will it be the kind that despises and dismisses it? What Islam, for example, needs, I think, is a reformation, small r, in the spirit of dignitatis humanae. The caliphate has no room for individual rights, and no version of faithful Islam will want to make room for a form of liberalism that shreds religion, nor should it. In contrast to the worst excesses of radical individualism today, dignitatis humanae makes it possible to explain why religious freedom is good, because it starts with why religion is good. This is the kind of foundation rights need. Religious freedom today is caught between opponents on the left and the right. On the left, some who fight in the name of individual rights distort and weaken the concept so much as to make it meaningless and indefensible. Sometimes they explicitly attack religious freedom head-on in the name of more legitimate or more pressing so-called rights. On the right, witnessing the havoc in our society wreaked in the name of liberty, some have concluded that liberty is the problem. In these circumstances, we need to discover or recover a proper account of rights. That begins with a proper grasp of the good of religion, and finally, all the goods that constitute human flourishing. Thank you.
That was extraordinarily impressive. Thank you very much. We have a tradition here at the Tocqueville Program of inviting our undergraduates to ask the first question. If you do have a question, please stand so we can all hear you and tell us who you are, and speak loudly. I'm going to have you repeat the question for the recording.
Excellent.
Yeah. Please.
Hi, I'm David Shank. I'm a senior accounting major here at Notre Dame. And my question relates to the first part of your lecture, where you kind of outlined sort of hierarchy of issues going on the international scale, with ISIS as a totalitarian threat. You have all the blasphemy laws, you have domestic issues on a national scale and on the state scale. And so I'm wondering, sorry, I don't know more about what your commission does specifically, but I'm wondering how you individually prioritize the international issues, and also how your commission kind of prioritizes them as well, from like an agenda perspective of which things to address first, second, third, etc.
Yeah. The question was, how do I individually or the commission as a whole prioritize the issues in international religious freedom? Is that fair enough? I'm just going to give a shorter summary of your question for the camera. Well, really good question. And don't worry about knowing. I always say, well, what can we do? And I always say, well, the first thing is you can pray, but the second thing is you can educate yourself about the issues in international religious freedom, because we believe on the Commission our main job, according to the statute, is to advise the White House, the State Department, and Congress on U.S. foreign policy related to the promotion of religious freedom abroad. And the biggest help we can get if we're going to shape foreign policy in the direction of U.S. foreign policy in the direction of religious freedom is to have constituents making it clear to their elected representatives that the religious freedom of people around the world is a priority for them. So no need to apologize at all. Not something you're expected to know about, but if you're interested, go out and educate yourself. Well, on one hand, it's impossible to prioritize, right? Because that's the obvious answer, because there are so many problems in the world with religious freedom. There's that Pew study that's really frequently quoted that says 75% of the world's population, approximately, lives in countries with high, I believe it's high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. And so there's no shortage of things to do. What we do, one of the big things we do is we have an annual report. And in the annual report, it comes out at the end of, by May 1st of each year. So we're like deep into annual report season right now, working on it. And one of the things we do is the main part of the report is reporting on the worst countries in the world. And we have that divided up into two sections, Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 are countries that we believe are guilty of perpetrating or tolerating systematic, egregious, and ongoing violations of religious freedom. That's the definition in the law. And if we put the country on Tier 1, that means we are recommending that the State Department designate that country as a country of particular concern. Tier 2 is kind of next level issues that, not next level in the colloquial sense, but the next level down, where we think there are issues but doesn't quite rise up to the level of that statutory standard of systematic, egregious, and ongoing. So the first part of my answer to your question is we prioritize the worst problems in the world. We're a tiny little commission with a tiny little staff and a tiny little budget. And so we try to focus on the world, call attention to the worst problems in the world, the situations that are in most desperate need of help. Having said that, we also have to be smart about thinking about where we can have an impact. So for example, I mean, things are changing a little bit now. I don't really understand what's going on with the Olympics, but North Korea, right, is pretty much a pariah state that isn't interested in anything we say. So we can talk till we're blue in the face, and religious freedom isn't going to improve in North Korea. Again, I'd say notwithstanding the interesting developments that have just gone on the last few weeks that are probably, the consequences of which are probably unclear to everyone right now. So we also want to think about which countries and which situations and which actions are the areas where we can have the most impact. So sometimes that means thinking about the countries that we actually do have a good relationship with, that might be allies of ours, and think of how we might use that leverage, thinking where we have leverage. When Vietnam is one of the countries recommended, it's again a communist dictatorship, more or less. And during the Obama administration, there was a period where Vietnam was seeking membership in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? And so this just to give you one example of how this works is we might say, well, the US will support your membership in the TPP on condition that we see the following improvements in religious freedom and human rights more generally, or something like that. So I'll leave, if people want to follow up with more, but in other words, thinking two things in terms of priorities is what are the worst situations in the world and where are the situations where we can actually have an impact. And insofar as those coincide, I think we have our sweet spot. And I would say, and I won't really answer that separately for how I prioritize. I'm just trying to do whatever good work is in front of me to do. Thank you. Are you calling out?
Hi, my name is Lana Sherry, and I'm a junior here. And I had a couple of questions regarding what you said about Pakistan.
Yes.
So I was a little curious, where exactly were you in Pakistan?
Okay.
Because it just depends. I have a question after that. But.
Oh, you want to do one at a time? Okay. So where was I in Pakistan? I was in Islamabad and Lahore.
Okay. Okay. So it can really depend where you are. That's just what I've noticed in my experience as a native. I've lived there for 18 years. I definitely do, I'm with you with a lot of things you said about just the religious intolerance and like legal and political as well. And I definitely do not agree with the way things are happening there. But what I've learned from the social context, the reason why people have so many problems with the Ahmadis is because they believe in Prophet Muhammad, but they believe in the continuity of the message being spread.
Yes, exactly.
And if you read the Quran, there's two things. These are the two most important things, like two of the most important things that are mentioned. One is that there's only one God, and the second is that Muhammad is the last messenger.
Yes, absolutely.
So by saying that they believe in someone coming after Muhammad, they undermine the very one of the main principles, which is why people have a problem with it, and which is why people are more verbal about their dislike for the entities.
Good.
So that's just
excellent. Yeah.
This
Thank you for that. So let me address those. So 2 points about it depends where you are in the country, and second about the Ahmadis, better pronounced by you, Ahmadis. You're right. I just kind of say it the American way. Who draw the ire that they draw because they believe, as I mentioned in the speech, in a latter-day prophet, a prophet from the 1800s. That's why I made it's a loose comparison to be sure, but with the Mormons, right? And they are rejected by Muslims around the world. It's not just a Pakistan problem, as heretics for believing this. And as the questioner just said, I'm sorry, I just forgot your name. Sana. As Sana just said, correctly, that is in violation with what all the other Muslims take to be a core tenet of their faith. So first of all, it depends where you are. That's absolutely true. Pakistan is a huge country with a huge population, and this could be true of small countries as well, but certainly a huge country with different states and different state governments and a somewhat federal system. It's certainly different. Depending on where you are. Not everybody suffers in the exact same way, but it is true that the suffering of religious minorities in the country, Christians, Hindus, is widespread. And it's also true that not only do Ahmadis suffer, as far as I know, throughout the country, but the discrimination, as I said, is enshrined in the Constitution. The Constitution was amended to add specific provisions against them. As I said, there's a law that I was just rereading in the context of something that if they want to vote, they have to deny that, et cetera. And so all of those. So what you say about the Ahmadis and why they're discriminated against, I absolutely affirm. But what I'm affirming also, and I thank you for shedding further light on this, is I absolutely affirm their right to say these things. It may be that a lot of things you believe I think are false. I suspect a lot of things I believe you think are false. And what I'm affirming is the right for all of us to believe those things and to act accordingly. I don't think the government should be involved in whether, there are people, as you can probably tell, I'm Jewish, and there are people who lay claim to the title Jew or Jewish who I don't think are Jewish. Now, it happens to be I might not be as exercised about that as some Muslims might be about the Ahmadis, that's fine, but I don't think the government should get involved in whether they should be allowed to call themselves Jewish. And that is my point here, that no one should be persecuted by the authorities for their beliefs, and obviously the government must be extremely vigilant, as it is not at this time, in protecting people who are subject to these attacks at the societal level, right? Not through the authorities, all the lynchings and so on, right? So that's, yeah.
Yes, Julie, my main question was, so you said that you think that Islam requires some sort of reformation. But what I have noticed just as a Muslim is that we tend to think of ourselves as our certain sect of Muslim first. So for example, I'm an Ismaili Shia Muslim. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I have, certainly, yes.
Small for a Muslim sect. we're only 16 million in the world, but and so we tend to think of ourselves. Yeah, so we tend to think of ourselves first as Ismailis, then Shias, then Muslims, or first Sunni, then Muslims. So do you think it would be a better idea for Muslims to kind of come together and think of themselves as Muslims first, and maybe that way we'll kind of stop turning against each other, as opposed to trying to reform our faith? Good,
thank you. So the question was, would it be better for Muslims of different versions of Islam to come together and see each other, see themselves as Muslims first, and stop turning against each other rather than reforming the faith? So, my first answer is I take no view on that. That Muslims should do whatever Muslims want to do. Do I think if that's a plausible prescription for the future, that right, because much more, oftentimes much more, I think you were alluding to this, much more bitter than the conflict between Muslims and other groups is between, for example, Sunni and Shia, and you probably know, right, the bitter antagonism between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and so on and so forth. And so if there is some way to stop the, I guess what I'll call like the internal Muslim conflict, I mean, sure, the world would be a better place if Sunni and Shia and so on weren't killing each other. And you see that, right? You see the bombings here and there, and Muslim on Muslim violence, as it were. That's what I meant about the Islam needing reformation as the part of Islam, whichever part it is. And that's why I was careful. I mean, some people object from one side, the other side, but I use the term Islamist extremism rather than Islamic extremism to refer to Islamism, which is the term we typically use to refer to political Islam. Just to be extra careful. Whatever part of Islam today still endorses the use of violence or political violence, extra-legal violence, and so on, or even political legal violence against other believers, heretics, and so on. Right, that's the part that needs the Reformation. Right, there was a time, I don't know that there was ever a whole civilization built around this, but maybe some people know their history better than I do. Where if you read the Jewish Bible, what you might call the Old Testament, right, it talks about killing, that the state essentially wasn't a state, but the state should kill Sabbath breakers, for example. Right? That's not a policy I endorse or would want to see in our law today, right? But there was a time around, when Rabbinic Judaism emerged around the same time that Christianity, the early church, that the rabbis were hard at work, what I'll say, civilizing Judaism, right? Writing out, reinterpreting the Bible, or interpreting or reinterpreting in such a way that we ended up with a code of Jewish law that pretty much that doesn't have all that objectionable violence that we would associate with some of these prescriptions in the Bible. And Christianity too went through its violent times, and I think that most Christians today, certainly the Christians in the West with whom I'm familiar, don't endorse the kinds of violence that Christians used in history, and don't even endorse the church being a political entity the way the Vatican was at that time, and so on. And that's clearly not the case for some part of Islam today, and that's what I meant as far as having a reformation.
Let's open it up to anyone who might have a question. Please, Carl.
Hello, my name is Carl McCarthy. I study philosophy. So it's 2 questions. So could you just please elaborate on what you mean by religion being a good? So what religion is, and also if religious freedom is pursued for the sake of achieving some good, and not for the sake simply of protecting license. What does the government do when it witnesses license? How does it respond to license?
Good. Excellent question. So the first part is, and if I forget, I'll remind me the second one, but the first part of the question is, what do I mean by the good of religion? So here, I'm making reference to a concept that I take from natural law. So natural law is very closely associated with the teaching of the Catholic Church, because in its early, it goes all the way back to Aristotle at least, or not all the way back, most famously, I guess, to Aristotle. It's hardly the only figure. But today, natural law exists as a whole independent system of philosophy, not rooted necessarily in church teachings, though there's both. And natural law often speaks in terms of the basic goods or basic human goods or terms like that, that refer to the things that are constitutive of our flourishing just as human beings. And so depending on which school you associate yourself, a Notre Dame professor, John Finnis, has a famous book in which he gives, it's called Natural Law and Natural Rights, where he gives a proposed list of basic goods And the idea is that it's good for you just as such as a human person. We can take some easier examples. I'm not going to do Natural Law 101 right now for the sake of the audience, but the idea that life and health are better than death and sickness for the human person, that knowledge is better than ignorance, so on and so forth. And so in Natural Law and Natural Rights, Finnis proposes that one of the things that's good for us, just as such, as a constitutive element of our flourishing, is to, and he puts religion in quotes in that book, the book's from 1980, is to be in touch with whatever it is in the universe that exists, that's like out there beyond ourselves and beyond our mere existence. That insofar as anything like that exists, we are better off being aware of it, in touch with it, than we are being unaware of it or alienated from it. Now, of course, once you have that building block, you can layer all kinds of theology on top of it, right? I mean, if it is, I'll put it in a more religious way, if God does exist, then it is better to be close to God than to be distant from God, in whatever you take that to mean. So that would mean the good of religion. Now, your second question is, well, what about when government witnesses license? So I think there's a two-part answer here. I think the first part of the answer is that when it comes to truth-seeking, and like what Dignitas Humanae, the quote I read talks about it in the context of seeking the truth, and especially religious truth, the government should give a lot of latitude for error. And that's because when seeking truth, when seeking religious truth, the nature of God and so on, again, as Dignitas Humanae says, is if it is held coercively, then it is not truly held, right? If you believe something or do something just because I force you to do it, that's not real religion. That's just me forcing you to do something. And so there should be a lot of room for error. And this is why it's so complicated, because people like me who will take Lincoln's line that there's no right to do a wrong, or that sort of thing, right? But when it comes to truth-seeking, there has to be a lot of latitude for people to get things wrong, because without that latitude, what that is to say, with coercion instead, they can never actually hold the truth truly. Having said that, there are going to be exceptions. So first of all, when people violate other basic goods, so people who want to commit murder in the name of religion, God told me to kill so-and-so. I mean, that's right. It's hard because there are cases in the Bible like this, right, which I was talking about before in terms of Judaism getting civilized. Then the law should step in, right? The law does need to protect people from threats of violence and so on and so forth. I think the tougher question is the kind of license that we see today in society, where there's a very lively debate about whether the law should play a role in regulating, and that's what we typically call the family of morals laws. Morals laws refers to laws about morals. So should the government play a role in regulating things like drugs, prostitution, pornography? And in those cases, there's a lively debate here, even among natural lawyers, about how and when and why. But there you get into a lot of prudential judgments about if these things are intrinsically wrong, then to take the Lincoln line, no one has a right to do it, but it might not be very prudent for the government to step in, right? So it's on the pornography case, we might say, now you might think there's just a right to consume pornography, but let's say I disagreed with you and said, there's no right, this is an evil thing, there's no right to do it, and I don't need theology to prove it, I can prove it through moral philosophy. Then I will say that the government might have a right to regulate that, but I also might be of the view, this is not necessarily my view, but I might be of the view that the kind of intrusive government we would need in order to successfully regulate the consumption of pornography over the internet would be so intrusive that we'd be in a police state that none of us want to live in, kind of thing, right? Or you could take the other view and say that the government, right? Did Iceland do this? Is that where this happened? Where the government was just going to filter the internet of pornography. Anyway, okay, so that's, see, as you say, I'm very long-winded. I want to let more people ask. So I'll leave that as my answer for you now. And of course, follow up. I should say on that note, I brought a large box of my chairman cards from the commission because they look cool. So if anybody wants, to follow up with me afterwards, either on something I've said or something I haven't said, even if you don't want to wait in line to chat after, I'll just put a stack of them out here on the desk and just grab one and go.
Okay, we have a few
few more minutes, so let's get as many questions as
Okay.
we can.
I'll be as brief as possible.
Alumni, thanks for raising so many great topics. Thank you. I'm fascinated by the topic of laws that promote conformity, maybe with good reasons to promote cohesion and social order and stability, versus this freedom, which is great but can lead to chaos, like you kind of said with the classical liberalism. So how do you apply these things to laws like the anti-Burka laws in France? Are those laws that you guys think are good or bad? And also things about maybe the line between anti-hate speech versus blasphemy. For example, I can't insult Jesus or Muhammad because it incites people to violence. Are those anti-hate speech or is that blasphemy? Where do you draw the line between those?
Excellent. Okay, I just want to make sure. The first part of the question was about, just remind me, just give me the keyword right, like the anti-Burka laws, and then the second was about the line between hate speech and blasphemy and those sorts of things. On the anti-Burka laws, I can almost speak for the commission here because we do more or less have views on these things, but I'll just speak for myself and say generally I'm opposed to all of those things. I think that there are limits. So obviously there are legitimate security concerns. If a person wants to have his or her face completely covered, you can't do identification that way, right? If driver's licenses and so on serve any purpose, I assume it's to identify the person. And so one could imagine needing to have adjustments in the law. I'm very squeamish about the government. If we leave aside prudential considerations about safety, I get speaking for myself, very squeamish about the government getting involved and saying what's really behind the burqa or not behind the burqa, because I know that it's very difficult to make to draw a principled line between the burqa and, let's say, some other covering that might seem to us more benign. Now, I don't. It's very difficult because I understand that people say, well, actually, it's a tool of oppression of the patriarchy, so on and so forth, and so you can't. But I think that as a prudential matter, certainly we're probably better erring on the side of the government not getting involved. Again, leaving aside considerations of safety and security and that, if you're going to go through an airport, you might need to show your face or something like that. I don't have a good solution for people who say, as a religious matter, they can't. But obviously, these kinds of exceptions are possible. I mean, where this comes up in a more extreme way, I think, is with female genital mutilation that some people claim as a right in the name of religion, but which I think we can oppose both in principle and in practice without falling into the trap of what about male circumcision and so on and so forth. So I think there are places where we can make these arguments and draw lines, and then there's other places where I think we're better erring on the side of caution and respecting people's choices, while recognizing that there's many complex social factors that go into those choices. On the subject of hate speech, you said to be brief so you get more questions. I'm sorry, totally, I forgot. As soon as you said it, I forgot. On the subject of, so I'll say, I'm pretty extreme free speecher, and I think that the position that the United States has taken at the UN, you can look up 1618, is very good. Historically, and this continues to be, that no religion is entitled to have blasphemy laws to insulate it from offense. Hate speech laws, prudential often, but blasphemy and hate speech, first of all, they're different things. And if you think they're the same thing, then I would probably stand up and defend the person's right to say that the thing that you think is hate speech. I think it's a very bad idea in principle and in prudence for the government to get involved in regulating the people's expression of views, even if they're offensive, even if they're hateful, obviously recognizing the standard line that incitement to violence is not protected.
Maybe one more quick question. I have my own question I want to get.
I'll do lightning questions, lightning answers. Only yes or no.
John Merriam, major in program of liberal studies, which is our great books major. So just, what are your top 5 books for this topic that you'd recommend?
Oh my gosh. Is this topic international religious freedom or classical liberalism, or I don't even know where we are?
More modern books on international religious freedom.
Okay, well, Dan Philpott is here. So if you just go, do Amazon Dan Philpott, and he's got a new book coming out on Islam and international religious freedom. It's going to be amazing. You've also got the co-authored book, God Century. Is that the one that you're the co-author of, God Century, with Tom Farr and Timothy Shaw? Do I have that right? I'm close. And yes, that's right. Sorry, bad mistake. So you're lucky to have these kind of people around you. On what's good on, there aren't a lot of. So I'll just give you the names. So Timothy Shaw, Monica Shaw, that's S-H-A-H is the last name. Thomas Farr. These are some of the leading contemporary thinkers, along with Dan Philpott, on international religious freedom today.
Farr has a book called World of Faith and Freedom.
Yes, it's on my shelf. Excellent. Right. That's why I was forgetting the titles, and that's why I just went to the author names. It's like if you look up those author names, none of those people has so many books that you won't find the right ones. Am I forgetting anything else that I should?
If you're interested in the Christian angle, John Allen is excellent.
Okay, John Allen, for the record, just for the microphone, John Allen. Okay.
I'm going to ask you the question that everyone wants to ask but is too afraid. What are the Canadian blasphemy laws?
So I'm actually told that there is a movement. It's like a little bit on the DL right now, I think, but I'm not sure about that. There's a movement afoot in Canada to repeal that law, and I hope it happens. And until it does, I'm going to keep shaming them. So we blame Canada. It's real. So if you look up our report, this blasphemy report, which you'll be curious to see the list of the 70, 60 whatever countries that are on. So actually it does this. I mean, they tried to actually not catalog them, but even score them on a scale of how bad they are, and it includes the text of what the law actually says. So you can look up, from Saudi Arabia and Iran to Canada and Switzerland and so on. But yeah, be careful what you say in Canada. Let it be known.
Okay. Yeah. We have two very special guests here who I want to acknowledge. They'll probably be mad at me, but Chairman Mark's wife, Madeline, is here. And the baby,
she's real mad at you for...
and the baby they're about to have. So our prayers with you.
Thank you.
And maybe our most important lecture to date. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Please join me.